Well, on this fifth Sunday of Ordinary Time, we're still unpacking this power-packed chapter 1 of St. Mark. We're in year B, so we're diving into St. Mark. Today's gospel passage reveals the dramatic events happening early in Jesus' public ministry. Right? Jesus is from Nazareth, but he goes to the Sea of Galilee, and Capernaum specifically, calling on his initial disciples, Luke, and John, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, right? That they live in the town of Capernaum. And he's made Peter's house a kind of headquarters for his public ministry. And so people are showing up at his door. It was so awesome to be able to spend that time with you at that spot of Peter's house, where there's a church now. And many of our parishioners came on that pilgrimage, our parish pilgrimage to the Holy Land in 2018. And we got to be on the very spot where all kinds of healings that Jesus did happened, right? Not only physical maladies, but spiritual maladies, right? He was driving out demons. We all have our demons that beguile us to sin against God and against one another. And Jesus was driving them out of people left and right. And so, friends, the healing that Jesus did in that little corner of the world that we call the Holy Land 2,000 years ago, Jesus still does today in little corners throughout the entire world. See, Jesus still does it through his mystical body, the church, so that his reach is not limited to Israel, but can extend throughout all the nations. And he does so through the members of his body. He does these supernatural healings and miracles still, and mysterious and inexplicable apparitions and divine manifestations that pop culture and the powers of this world would rather not promote. But they are there for us to discover if we desire to seek them. In fact, we in our own parish have experienced one of those divine manifestations. Today, February 4th, is the 13th anniversary of what? Can anybody guess what happened 13 years ago this day? Yes, we had our own Eucharistic miracle over at St. John's School. That made the news, and we heard it. I won't go over it now because it was featured in Faith Magazine, and Bishop Boyer made it one of the topics of the On the Road to Emmaus videos that we have been watching before each Sunday Mass in this year of Eucharistic revival. And so I'm not mentioning it now because I want to mention another occasion. On this occasion of the anniversary of our own Eucharistic miracle, I'd like to share about another one that I learned about in greater depth at the annual Legatus Summit that I attended last week. Most of you know that I serve as the chaplain for the Ann Arbor chapter of Legatus, which is an organization of Catholic business leaders whose stated mission is to study, live, and spread the faith in their business, professional, and personal lives. And so in the summit this year, with the church in America being in the midst of this national Eucharistic revival, we heard about a few of the Eucharistic miracles that have happened in our own lifetime and have gone through rigorous scientific investigation that point to its supernatural character, like the one in Mexico that happened in 2006, the one in Poland, 2009. And so I want to share the one that Pope Francis himself was involved in at his home archdiocese of Buenos Aires in Argentina. So this Eucharistic miracle happened in 1996. And there was an abandoned Eucharistic host that was found at the back of the church. You know, this is why we always make sure that anyone who receives the Eucharist in the hand actually consumes the body of Christ before they begin walking back to their pew. I've actually had to walk after people who have taken the consecrated host without consuming the body of Christ way too many more times than I would like, right? That's absolutely forbidden due to risks of desecration. For example, what's needed for a satanic black mass to happen is an actual consecrated host, which in the black mass they desecrate in all kinds of horrible ways, including the use of bodily fluids that we won't talk about. So anyway, someone finds this abandoned host and gives it to the pastor. When we see a host, like for example, if it drops to the ground, I immediately pick it up and consume it so as to save the person the trouble of wondering like whether they should do that. 10-second rule, right? So I just do it for them so they don't have to think about it and have them feel more embarrassed than they already are, right? So, but I've done that too many times as well, which is why we trained our servers to use patens during the distribution of Holy Communion to minimize that risk. But this host had become dirty, right? It was found, who knows how long it had been there, and the proper way to dispose of such a host is to dissolve it in water, which takes just a few days before it becomes sufficiently dissolved to pour back into the hollowed earth. And so they come back several days later, and they notice not only has this host not dissolved, but there appears to be a red scar on the host itself. So the pastor orders it to be left in the tabernacle, and they do so for another 24 days. So it's been basically a month, right? Because it should dissolve by 4 days max. By this time, what looked like a scar on the host now had some dimensional depth to it. Something was growing out of the host. A substance was growing out of the host. And so they took pictures of the host, they sent it to the archdiocese, and they decide that in order to test whether or not this is a Eucharistic miracle, they will actually store the consecrated host in sterile water, right? And they keep it in sterile water for an entire 3 years. 3 years. Now, for a host not to experience significant autolysis, which is like, the decomposition or destruction of cells and tissues by their own enzymes, it's impossible for that to happen. But it did. And so that's when Pope Francis got further involved. And he says, let's call a scientific expert to analyze this consecrated host. So in comes Dr. Ricardo Castañón Gomez, who was a reputable research lab scientist who, at least back then, was basically an atheist. And they wanted someone to research this who had nothing to gain, who didn't have a dog in the fight, so to speak, right? So Dr. Ricardo Castañón Gomez photographs the host and compares it to the original photos taken. And he sees that there has been no significant dialysis from what he had presently to the photos that were taken years back. And so to help corroborate the work that he was doing, Dr. Castañón Gomez sends thin samples to 3 other labs, one in Italy, one in Australia, and one in New York. Because in New York was Dr. Frederick Zugabe, a respected forensic pathologist. And Dr. Zugabe got some of his training at Columbia University and was a fellow in a number of associations on cardiology, wrote a number of books on pathology. So he was the chief medical examiner in Rockland County, New York. So he had some chops, right? And Zugabe was a Catholic. And he's passed now. Was and died a Catholic, right? But he had no idea the nature of the fragment that was sent to him, right? They didn't reveal that to him. All that he had been sent was a very thin fragment of the substance growing out of the host. So after Zugabe examined the fragment, he noted a number of unusual things, right? Among them was the fact that there were active white blood cells in this tissue. So he asked if they had taken the sample from someone who had just died, because he couldn't believe it, right? It simply would be unintelligible for this sample with living white blood cells to have come from anything other than an embodied circulatory system. And so he also found that not only was the sample heart tissue, but specifically heart tissue from the left ventricle of the heart, right? He could tell that from the proximity of the striations to one another. Interestingly enough, it is the upper left, that left ventricle of the heart that pumps the blood to the rest of the body, right? And Zugabe also noted that the white blood cells embedded themselves into the ventricle wall. And apparently this only happens when someone experiences a polytrauma. So a polytrauma is multiple injuries that involve multiple organs or systems. So now when Gomez hears this testimony, he's saying, man, I better rethink this atheist thing, right? And as for Zugabe himself, the guy from New York, he was interviewed by the two Australians who finally revealed to him the nature of the sample. And they asked him, would you be surprised to know that this sample that you've been researching was taken from a consecrated host? And he just sat there with his jaw dropped, because he was a practicing Catholic and he knew what a consecrated host was. And he was speechless for about 5 minutes, just trying to fathom and process the significance of what he was just told. Right? Because as Father Bob Spitzer, who is the Jesuit that was a speaker at Legatus that was explaining this to us, he himself has some chops, literally a genius, and was one of the presidents of Gonzaga University. He said, impossibile, right? He kept on saying, impossibile. That sample was living heart tissue with active white blood cells. It's simply impossible for it to be alive at the time of its testing. There's no natural explanation for it, right? His examination further revealed an AB blood type consistent with all the other Eucharistic miracles that had been scientifically examined. So that's what happened, and we all have to ask ourselves, how would we have reacted, right? See, God doesn't strong-arm us into belief. For those who seek, there's ample evidence of his presence. But he allows that so he doesn't destroy our free will, so that because he wants a relationship of love with us, not a relationship of coercion. So the ample evidence is there for those who seek. Brothers and sisters, Jesus literally wants to give his heart to you, right? God took on our human flesh so that he could express his love in a human way. In the Eucharist, he spiritually and bodily wants to give his heart to you. And a beautiful, analogy of it being the left ventricle, right? That pumps out blood to the rest of his precious blood out to the rest of the mystical body of Christ. We all. What is happening at Holy Communion is a transfusion of his grace, a transfusion of his very life to us. He wants to give his sacred heart to us. On June 15th, that was of last year, because the solemnity of the Sacred Heart varies from year to year. The date does, just like Easter. That was June 15th was the eve of the solemnity of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, when we enthroned the Sacred Heart of Jesus at our parish. We had a great turnout. Many of you were there, and many of you then took the images of the Sacred Heart that we handed out at that Mass and celebrated an enthronement of the Sacred Heart in your home. And so that visible reminder that Jesus and his Sacred Heart sits on the throne of our homes, and figuratively the throne of our hearts. All right? At that Mass, we took a collection, and that collection we said was going to be used to strike up an image of the Sacred Heart, just for our parish alone, right? And so I want to reveal to you the results of that was completed on January 25th of this year by local artist Joseph Macklin, who has quit teaching art in order to dedicate himself full-time in creating sacred art. And he is just produces exquisite work. And this is the image that he struck up specifically for our parish. And it says here on the letter behind, this Sacred Heart is undeniably inspired by Andrea de Bartolo's Christ the Redeemer Giving His Blessing. The painting style is International Gothic, which fundamentally references the Neo-Gothic style of church architecture from St. John the Evangelist Church. However, this image features Christ wearing priestly garments and with a border featuring the apostles. In fact, for you to get a closer look, I'm going to have Owen project the image so you can have a closer look of the details here. So notice That's the main image there of the Sacred Heart. Notice his priestly vestments, and a detail of that priestly vestment. He has the apostles on there because we're St. John the Evangelist. And so on that stole area, you see the apostles, you see the Sacred Heart itself, where the blood, the precious blood flowing from his heart and from his wounds, and it's being directed towards the chalice that you see there. And notice that church. What does that church remind you of? Right? It's St. John Church, the facade of our beautiful Gothic church, and making it unique, this image unique to our parish. And notice how the chalice is on the edge, the table's edge. That is there on purpose because it's ready to be poured out. His precious blood is ready to be poured out to you and me. Right? That's what happens at every Mass. Right? And so, thank you for showing that. So, God's providence. We have this image struck up in the year from last year's collection, and then this year on June 16th, basically the 1-year anniversary of that enthronement of the Sacred Heart, we will have the opportunity to be in France at the Basilica of the Sacred Heart in Paris, right? The famous basilica where Jesus appeared, that site, Jesus appeared to St. Margaret Mary, Alacoque, the revelation of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. But that visit will be, this pilgrimage to France, will be just one of several sacred sites on this pilgrimage as we take a cruise down the historic River Seine. You'll draw closer to these saints that I mentioned in last week's bulletin, Our Lady of the Miraculous Medal and St. Catherine Labouré, which is, the patron saint of some area churches in our region. St. Joan of Arc, St. Vincent de Paul. A number of you are part of the St. Vincent de Paul Society that gives food to the poor. St. Therese of Lisieux. Many of you have the little flower as your favorite saint. And then there's an optional extension to Our Lady of Lourdes, which I won't be on just because I don't want to stay away from the parish those full 2 weeks. But I encourage you to go with Father Zach. He's going to take the whole... So Father Zach maybe is the one that basically plopped this pilgrimage right on our laps because he's been planning this for a while. Father Zach maybe is that 6'8" priest that has subbed here once in a while, right? We call him the high priest. And he and I he had enough people going that he could invite a co-chaplain along with him. So he and I are going to go together and lead anybody else who wants to come from our region. And so it's not just those pilgrim sites, but they'll also visit some historical and cultural sites like the Eiffel Tower, the Champs-Élysées, and other Parisian highlights like the Claude Monet estate. And for history buffs, the Normandy beaches and the World War II museums on those beaches. With the return trip to the Holy Land impossible to take, we were actually planning another pilgrimage this fall to the footsteps of St. Paul, like Philippi, Corinth, Turkey, Greece, all those places that he wrote letters to and established churches in. But with this falling on our lap, with this National Eucharistic Revival, you have 2 to choose from now, right? So, because we're joining Father Zach last minute, the deadline to register is February 15th. So, and there's only a limited number of cabins left. So please pray about that if you're considering it. But in conclusion, the Jesus that we encounter in the Gospels that we heard about is alive and well today. He manifests himself today and in and through his mystical body, his church, through the sacraments, through healing. We just had a healing of a baby in our Hope and Healing team. In the miracles, all these divine various manifestations that have happened throughout history, that is happening up to this present day. And in this year of National Eucharistic Revival, dear brothers and sisters, we highlight how Jesus wants to give his heart to each and every one of you. And that opportunity will come right at communion time. How will you respond? Will it just be casually going up to communion line and not even really paying attention to the one who you are about to become one with? Or in this Eucharistic revival, have a revival in your own heart of your desire to be one with the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings, to receive his very body and blood, soul and divinity with a renewed fervor like you've never had before, as if it was your first Mass, as if it was your last Mass, as if it was your only Mass. To echo Bishop Boyer, may it be the latter.